Hi everyone. In the next few minutes today, I'm going to be talking about different ways that we as faculty in the communication department can better understand and use assessment to be more effective instructors and create better classes for our students. This slide shows an overview of the 6 different topics I'll be addressing today. And I've included this image of a circle with interconnecting parts to emphasize the notion that each of the pieces that I'll be addressing today are interconnected. They feed into each other and provide a sort of cycle or a loop that helps create good alignment and effective, strongly well-designed classes. So that's an overview of the different topics that I'll be covering in the next few minutes. The first one has to do with course learning objectives, or CLOs. These are the specific descriptions of what an instructor or course designer believes that students should be able to do by the end of a course. Good course design begins with the end in mind, and so these are typically 5 or 6 or so statements that are assertively presented and typically included on the syllabus. This is the way to generate evidence that a student has successfully completed the course, that they have gained particular skills or particular understandings of concepts, that they've been able to do something that indicates that knowledge. A good CLO and a set of good CLOs are really important for students because they identify specifically what they should be able to do by the end of the term. They also help the instructors then use those CLOs to create great assessments and assessment activities, which I'll talk about in a minute. When you write CLOs, it's really important to think carefully about the language that you're using. Avoid terms like be familiar with or understand or write, since those are vague and passive and really non-measurable. Instead, use powerful active verbs like analyze, define, identify, evaluate, words that are active and measurable and can be tied to specific outcomes. So this example here, write research paper, is a really vague, ambiguous, non-measurable kind of CLO. It wouldn't be very helpful for either the student or the instructor. Instead, revamp it to say something like, student will use appropriate research methods to design and carry out research projects. That's much more active, measurable, and useful for a student to follow a class carefully. That leads us into the idea of alignment, keeping things together. Alignment between the CLOs and the particular assessment and assessment activities is so important. It creates an effective, efficient, clear, well-coordinated class and a good learning opportunity for students. Alignment between the CLOs and the assessments permits students to more easily understand and follow the purpose of their course and their greater program. And that often happens when specific course outcomes are linked to particular assignments and unit topics. One way that I think is very useful to align CLOs with assessment is to actually incorporate the language of CLOs into actual assignments or assessment. For instance, if you have a CLO to identify ethical issues in intergenerational communication, that's your CLO, you might use that exact verbiage or similar verbiage in a discussion board question or another unit project or some other kind of activity that you've created. This helps connect unit objectives, so the weekly or bi-weekly objectives, with the broader objectives for the class, and it also links each activity with the CLOs. So you can see hopefully that you have this cyclical process where course development starts with those course outcomes, which is motivated by a description of what learners should know by the end of the course. And then these, to lead to those CLOs, their associated course activities with relevant and appropriate assessment, all of which are tied back to the CLOs. Let's look at our next slide. This has to do with assessment planning. Learning is generally geared towards helping students move from a basic understanding using lower level skills on through increasingly complex skills called higher level skills. Bloom's taxonomy, which is represented here in this pyramid, starting with at the base lower level skills on through higher level cognitive functioning, is one format or framework that shows how outcomes build on each other based on students' cognitive levels. And so when you're creating an assessment plan, assignments, and how the class is going to be structured, you should contemplate what you want students to do or learn and tie those into these different levels of Bloom's taxonomy. You might think about, okay, in Unit 1, I'm going to focus on simply identifying some key terms. And then by Unit 3, they should be able to apply these to particular case studies. And by the end of the unit, they should create, perhaps a new framework for understanding these concepts or skills. So you can see how they build on one another as you move throughout a term or throughout a program. One particular approach to learning, to education, is called a learner-centered approach or environment. This has a key focus on the learning process, including what and how a student is learning, the context for learning, and what's being applied and retained by the student. In this approach, students should be really heavily involved in the assessment and are quite empowered and actively involved in the learning process. There's, under using this approach, a lot more autonomy and flexibility for the student. So for instance, in terms of assessment, using the learner-centered approach, a student might have the choice of what to focus their final project on. They choose a topic that is relevant to their career or to something they're passionate about. And then even the form of how they present their final project might be up to them. So instead of just writing a research paper, a student might have the option of creating a YouTube video or an interactive site or a web page or a portfolio, or even a research project if that works well for them. There's also an element of reflection that's a big part of the learner-centered environment, where students not only go through the process of learning, but they also take time to reflect on that process, which in turn, as an added bonus, provides valuable feedback to the instructor. Let's look about next a little bit about collecting assessment data. So there's two major areas of assessment. These lines can sometimes be blurred, but this is still a useful way of thinking about assessment. Formative assessment happens during the learning process. This should be done regularly and should comprise the majority of assessment in a particular course. Formative assessments help an instructor gauge, respond to student learning. Some examples might be simply asking a class for feedback or questions. It might be an email exchange with a student of clarifying a particular term or a particular assignment. These are often informal but could be more formalized as well and are typically low stakes. For instance, in Unit 2, students might be asked to submit a final project topic. It might be worth points. If so, it'd be a fairly small number of points, and at that point the instructor can provide the go-ahead about the topic as well as some feedback and maybe some direction about where the student could go next. So that's formative assessment. By contrast, summative assessment measures what students have learned, but it is not necessarily ongoing throughout the term. These are performance evaluation reviews, often used at the end of the term or the end of a unit, such as a final research project or a unit project. It's usually linked to major CLOs, and it's really focused on measuring student achievement and mastery of the subject material. Generally speaking, effective feedback helps learners improve their performance. It should be supportive, neutral, and professional. Timeliness is really important, especially in an online environment. I found that integrating feedback into a student's document through the Track Changes feature in Word is really useful. It provides sort of a conversation between what the student is communicating and my feedback to them. Allows you to be somewhat informal, but also perhaps add hyperlinks to for instance, the Writing Center on citation if a student is struggling with that. Again, this should be detailed, quick, neutral in the sense that there's no unnecessary negativity in the tone, and also professional in the tone. Certainly, Interactive technology with its high bandwidth has changed the way assessment can occur in higher education. There's often assessment that can be on demand. For instance, I teach a class where students take a practice quiz where they get immediate results of which questions they got correct and which they got incorrect, which allows them to then review key terms they may have misunderstood or not studied adequately, so that when they take the actual quiz, they know what to expect. So they have that real-time, on-demand feedback. One final point I want to talk about in terms of collecting assessment data has to do with rubrics. Rubrics should take the mystery and guesswork out of grading, and they should be clear, specific, fair, and they should also involve a tremendous amount of revision as instructors critically assess what's working well and what might be unclear. And that leads to this idea of using or interpreting the assessment results. Interpreting an assessment is really its primary focus, but in order for an interpretation to be useful, it needs to be placed in a frame of reference. So when it comes to formative assessment, which is again embedded in instruction and helps shape and direct teaching and learning, criterion reference frames, including learner feedback, are typically most appropriate for formative assessment. When it comes to summative assessment, this generally involves norm-referenced interpretations. In other words, where a student is compared to a set of norms, because there's typically a broad array of content involved for summative assignments. The final point I want to talk about is that assessment is a process. Creating good CLOs, assessment activities should be constantly revised and edited and critically assessed. Some specific ways that I found are helpful to do this is to, first of all, look at those CLOs and make sure that they're fair, reasonable, that they're clear. Never underestimate the power of a strong, clear CLO as part of the assessment loop. Linking your assessments back to great CLOs can help verify that alignment that I talked about a few minutes ago. Secondly, seek and respond to student feedback consistently and quickly, and then incorporate that into the assessment. Again, this is a dynamic process. Next, consider whether an assessment activity is primarily testing for recall, for critical thought, for creativity, and think about how that alignment is working and whether there needs to be revision. And finally, even when a student might challenge a grade or an activity, use that as an opportunity to consider the intentions of the assessment and perhaps whether it has some socio-cultural assumptions that might need to be have a closer look taken at. Again, this leads to the whole notion that assessments should be minorly tweaked or undergo major revamps as an instructor learns and seeks feedback from students. So I hope this has provided some useful guidelines for you as you work on understanding and creating more effective assessment. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.